Well, Natalie, thank you very much for agreeing to come and talk to us. Natalie Bennett, leader of the Green Party, which I guess we at Compass see as an ally and a friend, but also a source of challenge, which is always helpful. And in these conversations, really we're trying to listen and learn to the perspectives of people in the forefront of politics and begin to emerge a response to some of the questions that we've been asking ourselves about the good life and about what we're calling the open tribe. How could we create a sort of pluralist society which nevertheless has solidarity? So I thought, particularly from a group perspective, I'd start off on the question of the good life.
Right.
If you had to describe what the good life could be, what would it be like?
Well, I think it's a question, if you ask people, what do you want to achieve? How do you want to spend your time? People say that they want to spend some of their time doing work, doing constructive, worthwhile jobs that they actually feel like they're making a contribution with. But they also want to spend a lot of their time with friends and family and community to follow their interests, their leisure time. So I think one of the things we need to focus on is we recognise now that getting more stuff hasn't made people any happier. All the figures show that past a certain level, people don't get any happier with higher incomes. We know from the spirit level just how much inequality in society does great damage to people. And if you have a very unequal society where the ladder is very, very steep, people feel like they have to cling onto the rung and try and climb higher, and the penalties for sliding down are really way too great. And you almost feel like, to continue the metaphor, if you start sliding down the ladder, you get such momentum that you can end up right at the bottom, and the bottom is a very miserable place to be. So if we have a much more equal society, you can move around on that field, that nice level field, and be in different places doing different things at different times in your life. And so what the good life means, a very equal society. It means a society in which everyone has the basics, has a decent amount of food, shelter, comfort, the feeling that they can participate in any part of society they want to participate in. But of course, the other point we have to make with all of this is that we have to be able to provide this for future generations as well. And at the moment, given the resources we're using on the planet, we need to go back to one planet living. At the moment, we're living in 3 planet living in Britain. So we can do all of those things and give people a better life. And that's what I think we have to say is, the last 3 decades of this neoliberal model of growth, of striving, of a very steep ladder that everyone's scrambling to climb up and worried about falling down, that really hasn't delivered us a good life. And we need to look towards a different model of society, a different kind of economy to deliver that good life.
So say some more about the one planet living. Does that mean we stop growing as an economy? How are we going to stop wasting too much resource?
Well, I think the thing is, if you look at what we need to do is restructure our economy. A huge amount of what we do is wasteful and is of no benefit to everyone. I'm quite rather pleased that I have a big picture and quote in Flight International magazine, who got very excited about my pointing out that flying empty planes into Heathrow so airlines can keep their slots was a very bad thing. And we do huge numbers of things like that. So what we need to do is, yes, we do actually materially need less in the end of the day. But of course you can't say to someone, I was at an event last night about food poverty, and there were people there who were talking about regularly skipping meals so their children could eat. Now you can't say to someone in that situation, you have to cut back. That's why the equality part of it is really critically important. But we do need to live within the limits of the planet, and that means we need to stop flying in beans from Kenya and peas from Peru. But the good side of that is that we also need to bring food production back to Britain. It's not that long ago that every town and city was surrounded by a ring of market gardens. Now, if we bring that back, then what we're doing is actually creating a whole lot of jobs, a whole lot of small businesses, opportunities for cooperatives to grow the food, to have the outlets in the town that sell the food, to create a whole different model of a relocalised economy. Same thing with manufacturing. Where there's that famous large ship that arrives every Christmas with a whole load of plastic tat from China. If instead of those kind of things, the £5 t-shirts in the high street shops that produce the kind of misery that we saw with the Bangladeshi factory collapse, if we bring that production back to Britain, you might have fewer t-shirts of better quality and without all of those costs that aren't really counted now that we're inflicting on the world with the £5 t-shirt.
So how much of this is the role of government and how much of this is the role of us as individual citizens, and how do we get that balance right?
Well, I think in the Green Party, we're not primarily concerned with the actions of individuals. We're doing politics because we believe that we have to make doing the green thing, as a sort of shorthand, the easiest, simplest and cheapest option. I mean, I was talking to a Green Party campaigner down in Devon who was saying that, because she really believed in it, she took her 2 children and her partner, they went on a trip 50 miles away by train, and it cost them £120. If they'd done it in the car, and they have a car because, for various reasons you do need a car, it would have cost, maybe £20. And, you can't fault people for going for the £20 option rather than the £120 option. What we have to do is make, public transport cheap, reliable, efficient, and the obvious way to go. And until you do that, you absolutely shouldn't criticise any individual for choosing to take the car instead or for making those kind of choices.
So it's the job of government to make those choices easy to make in the right way by changing the nature of the market, I guess is what you're saying.
Yeah, well, exactly. In terms of, there's absolutely no point in preaching to people and saying you have to do things differently. What we need to do is make sure that the cost of any item is the real cost of the item. I mean, that £5 T-shirt on the high street, if you cost in the cost of all of the carbon emissions that you've shipped it to 3 or 4 different places to turn it into a T-shirt all around the world, the 10-year-old Azerbaijani boy who picked it in the fields and all the cost of that damage, the cost of the horrible conditions in Bangladesh where it was sewn up, all of those things, you put those costs in. And those things simply aren't counted at the moment, and they need to be.
But it's both, isn't it, in a way, because in order for people to vote for those policies, they have to be aware and uncomfortable about the boy in Azerbaijan and what's happening in Bangladesh, and they have to take seriously the environment in order to think it is worth supporting policies that are going to change what government does, don't they?
But it has to look viable. And one of the problems is, people buy the £5 T-shirt because they're on a minimum wage that isn't a living wage, and therefore, you can't say to someone who's trying to survive in London on the minimum wage, you shouldn't buy that £5 T-shirt. It's perfectly understandable why they are buying that £5 T-shirt. So, we have a situation where lots of people are forced into bad choices by the decisions of government. I mean, I think what we need to be very clear on is the way things are is not some kind of natural, automatic result, and we've got to change it. The way things are is because of decisions made in the past. The active actions of government have put us where we are. It's not some kind of natural, reflexive, can't be changed kind of thing. We chose to be here. We can choose to be in a different kind of place. I mean, I think, go back to my grandparents. The furniture, they had I think it was a diamond wedding anniversary, whatever it is when you get to an awful lot of decades, and they still had the same furniture that they bought when they got married and moved into the house. How many people is like that now? And it was perfectly good furniture. It's the kind of furniture that I'm actually, since my modern sofa has collapsed, I'm thinking about buying on eBay of the same era. And so,
yes.
We've lost lots of things, we've lost lots of quality things, and, buying a new sofa every 5 years when the one you just bought collapsed doesn't make anyone any happier.
Yeah, when my mum died, I inherited the utilitarian table she'd bought in the war when they got married, It wasn't a very good table.
Well, yeah, okay.
But yes, I agree with you that. Can I switch to the question about politics? Because Compass has got Labour Party people and Liberal Democrat people and Green people and Independents and Plaid Cymru and a whole range of different people from different parties, which we're finding fascinating and exciting, but obviously that raises all sorts of interesting questions about the political world. And so how can different parties work together in the context of what will be eventually, fierce electoral competition? Is this mad?
I think what we need to do is acknowledge that in two areas, in kind of think tanky, thinking up ideas, thinking up policies, we should be able to work together. And in campaigns, we should be able to work together. I mean, last night I mentioned I was at the event about food poverty, and there was even, a Tory MP there who said some very good things that I can entirely agree with about the need to reshape the food system. Now, I was sitting there thinking, but I didn't say, well, yes, this is all very good, but you're not addressing any of the poverty part of the food poverty equation. She was just addressing what was wrong with our food system. But, it's important in that kind of cross-party context to try to be generous, to not attack the person who's just said something you agree with, even if you think it didn't go nearly far enough or wasn't pointed in the right direction. You've got to try and do that. But the big problem is, and I was thinking about this on the way here, because we have a first-past-the-post electoral system, and because we get locked in bitter contests, at some point in time, virtually every party against every party. And that leaves scars that just persist in the long term. Whereas, I don't have a lot of experience of continental Europe, but talking to politicians from continental Europe, they very much all the time acknowledging that the person I'm having this debate with now, I might be in coalition with, I might be, sharing, we might both be representing the same constituency in 6 months' time or whatever. And that does create a sort of more polite, more civilised kind of politics, whereas first past the post very much encourages the whole, politics as a football game kind of way of thinking about politics. I'm going to barge past this person and slam through and slam the goal in. And that really isn't a healthy kind of politics. And the other thing we know, of course, is that kind of politics also puts off and really discourages vast numbers of people from getting involved in politics, even to the very, very basic level of voting.
Well, and there is this very bitter tribal sort of antagonism between political parties, and a lot of that is the scars of things that have happened to people in the past. But actually, for most ordinary citizens, they agree with some of what one party says and some of what another party says, and they shift their votes around these days. They're not as tribal as they used to be. So that very antagonistic politics just looks a bit strange to me. If I think about my daughter, she can't quite see why everybody gets so angry about stuff that doesn't seem to her to be very important.
I really have to come back to the electoral system. First past the post so utterly doesn't represent, in no way represents where we are. And you look at the whole issues around turnout and that, and I've been thinking again. We were all, after the AV referendum, dreadful as it was, kind of thinking, we've just got to leave electoral reform, but actually we've really got to come back and fight it. And there is a real potential in terms of the House of Lords, which we've just had yet another scandal relating to the House of Lords. And it is worth putting some time and effort into saying, well, let's put PR into the House of Lords and have an elected House of Lords, and that would then be at least putting PR further into the system and some kind of step forward. And there'd be forced to be a slightly different politics come around that if you had a Lords election.
Because an appointed House of Lords is a sort of accident waiting to happen, isn't it, in terms of patronage and things, and
yes.
It's not sustainable. But I was just thinking, in a sense, the UKIP phenomena, not sure what we call it, is another piece of evidence about first past the post ceasing to function. We've got something like a 7-party system, probably 8 if you include the Stop Our NHS Being Privatised party, or whatever they're called. So first past the post, when you've got that number of parties, just seems to be bizarre. But we had the Lib Dems had an attempt to change it didn't work. Politically, how would we win support for that change?
Well, that's why I think the House of Lords is the place to start. And I also know the Electoral Reform Society has been looking at STV and local government elections, because I think there's some hope in terms of the fact that large parties aren't really that interested, that the 2 largest parties aren't really that interested in councils. And STV and council elections would be another way in which you can start to introduce systems that are fairer and that represent the community much better. So I think of course keep saying we should have PR in the Commons, but the answer might be to try and work around the Commons and work on other areas first, and sneak in that way, and then the Commons first past the post just looks more and more anachronistic and more not fitting for where we are now. And it's a way of approaching it.
And I have to ask, what's it like being a Green in the Westminster Village?
Well, it's quite interesting. I think Caroline Lucas does an amazing job. My first politics before I became a Green really was feminism. And I still do a lot of work with feminist campaigners and groups. And so I'm very aware. I've been to lots of meetings hearing female MPs talk about just how difficult it still is being a female MP in Parliament. And with Caroline being the lone Green and a female MP, I think she does a tremendous job, and it's enormously difficult. And that tribalism is something she encounters all of the time. just like, for example, and this happens at all levels. I mean, I live in Camden, the borough in North London, and we have one single Green councillor who also happens to be a woman. Sometimes it's very frustrating to try and find someone to second a motion that's absolutely most of the council chamber must agree with, but trying to get them to second a motion can be a real struggle, and that kind of tribalism, it's enormously difficult. So I think Westminster is, Caroline's done a lot of work on the need to reform Westminster. She was only telling someone last night that how one of the important things she was explained to her when she first arrived was that was the hook that you hang your sword on. And we are there's an awful lot of Westminster that's still stuck in somewhere around about the 17th century. I mean, Caroline and I have been doing quite a lot of work on the Remembrancer, who's the representative of the Corporation of the City of London, which on its own website says it exists to promote liberalisation of the financial industries and globalisation. The Remembrancer has a special place in Parliament that no other industry group, representative group has. So, the manufacturing industries don't have a Remembrancer, the old age pensioners don't have a Remembrancer. But, so, you're not just fighting all the tribalism, all the politics stuff, you're also fighting all of this incredible dead weight of tradition that really stops things getting done.
And it's not just Westminster, is it? It's the nature of politics itself, whether it's just UK politics, I don't know. But I mean, one of the things that we've been doing in Compass is working quite hard at changing the political exchange. So, I mean, Rosie's always been brilliant at getting us to make sure that when we're taking questions, we take a question from a woman, a question from a man alternately, and make sure that voices are equally heard, which has made a real difference to how meetings are held. We've tried to stop having panels of speakers who are all just sort of lecturing everybody and had conversations. We're having these conversations because we think that that's a different way of doing politics. But conventional politics is still very much transmit, tell, shout. Listening's pretty cursory. Exchange of ideas between people who think differently is frowned upon, and yet actually that's probably the only way we're going to solve things. So, I mean, part of what we're interested in is how we would make politics more generous, more curious, more interesting, more creative. Is this something that Greens have been trying to do, and how successful is that?
Well, I think so. I mean, we've moved away from some of our early origins. I believe, there were meetings held where there was a talking stick that was passed around the room and everyone, so some of those, I mean, you have the problem with those things can be tribal in their own right, and some person walking into that situation can find it quite threatening and quite difficult, and if you have a whole lot of rituals that look strange. But so what you really need to do is say at the start of the meeting, make sure that chairing is shared around and that lots of people are trained to chair, and say at the start of the meeting, right, these are the rules. We're going to make sure that no one dominates. Everyone has the chance to speak, although we're not going to force people to speak, because one of the things that terrifies people at meetings, some people don't want to speak, and that's fine too. And you've just the way you structure a room, all of those kind of things is we try in the Green Party to create an open kind of environment that's accessible to everyone, and it's really important to acknowledge everyone will have something to contribute to that meeting. I mean, again, just thinking back to the food poverty meeting last night, there was a woman from Disabled People Against the Cuts who pointed out that sort of all the government rules say that you're catered for as a disabled person if you're able to microwave your own food. That's enough. You won't get any other special help with food. But if you only live on microwave food, and that implies maybe not even cutting things up and basically living on ready meals. And it was something that that I hadn't occurred to me before. Didn't even really know that's the rules. But and it's someone from the actual experience, who's the lived experience. And we absolutely have to acknowledge lived experience. The real experts in that room last night were the people who've experienced food poverty. It wasn't a whole lot of politicians and academics, saying what they thought about it. And you've got to try and get those people in the room, and that's really challenging. And you've got to create the right environment, because otherwise it's all just too big and scary and difficult.
So, if this, I was about to say established political parties, but the Greens are pretty established now. But if older parties were going to learn from the Green experience about how to do politics and about how to work with people, what learning would you recommend they think about?
Well, I think in some ways perhaps it's a question of restoring things. I mean, basically restoring democracy, which I think has largely disappeared from the three largest parties. It's true of others too, but particularly those three. I mean, I was talking to a BBC journalist who was he's doing an article on how you select candidates, and they were absolutely astonished that we don't shortlist when you're selecting parliamentary candidate. Anyone who puts themselves forward gets put to the electors. And the BBC journalist was astonished, and I was kind of vaguely astonished and surprised, and then I thought, oh yeah, I can see why she is thinking that's really strange, because there's no control from the centre. I mean, in the Green Party, each local party is sovereign. They can basically, decide what they want to campaign on, select their own candidates, choose their own path, and unless they go absolutely, wildly off track, then that's fine. Sometimes the centre mightn't like it, but that's just the way it is. And I think what's happened with the three largest parties is you've just ended up being centralised towards a presidential system, and the leaders' debate last time encouraged this probably even further. And if you're all relying on one person, that's an incredibly fragile system to have the whole thing built around one person. One
bad interview causes
well, exactly, and it's also, one person is going to have a very narrow perspective on the world. They can't, you only have your own perspective, and if you're not drawing on, a big, obviously not everyone in the Green Party can make every decision, but we have conference that decides our policy. We have elected people, like our external comms coordinator is elected, and they're the person who has day-to-day oversight of our direction, or people, actually it's a job share, but who have oversight over our messaging, all of those kind of things. And so you're drawing on everything from the base is feeding into the top. It's not the top just going, right, this is what we're doing, off you will go and do it.
And do you have quotas for women the way the Labour Party has?
We have the tricky situation, of course, because we can't dictate to the local parties. But what we're doing, and we're working towards this, we've changed the selection procedure so that if after the first round of nominations no women have stood, you have to reopen nominations for an extra 2 weeks or whatever it is. And that's so there's a very strong impetus to encourage people to make sure there's a woman standing in that. And we've also empowered a couple of our equality and diversity coordinator and our elections coordinator to work with local parties to find ways to make sure we get to at least 50%. That's something that we've picked up from the European Greens. They have an at least 50% rule, which means you could actually get 60% women or 70% women or whatever. It's not gender balance, it's something more than that. And so, we're working towards it. And if you look at the Centre for Women and Democracy, we usually achieve, at the top in terms of the percentage of women candidates, but it still requires continual struggle and effort. And we're trying to get to the point where you don't have to struggle for that anymore.
It's interesting, in a number of the interviews that I've done, people have talked about quite emotional words. They've talked about kindness, they've talked about generosity, they've talked about wisdom, they've talked about love in some cases. These are not words that usually get used in politics, and certainly not, they don't crop up much.
We could do with a lot more wisdom, definitely, I think, particularly.
So I'm just interested sort of in your observations about how we might make the political process more congenial, I suppose. What might we do?
I mean, thinking back to Westminster particularly, just making it more sensible would be a really good start, so people can see the sense of why you're doing things. I mean, one of Caroline's other favourite stories, which is just my favourite story because it's so mad, is the last Parliament there was a Labour MP who had a 6-month-old baby, and apparently, because going through the voting lobbies, only MPs are allowed. So she wasn't allowed to carry the baby through the lobby. She had to just deposit it on the nearest person, walk through the lobby and come back and pick the baby up again. But, you tell people that, and it's clearly nonsensical. In the European Parliament, Caroline will say, they vote with cards. And so, it takes 10 seconds to do a vote. In the Commons, you're there and the bells ring and they're sprinting MPs in all directions, and it's all just absolute madness. And, no one knows whether they're going to get called or not in questions, so they're bobbing up and down in front of the speaker like this. All that sort of stuff. People don't know how long debates are going to go. amendments aren't explained so that people just react to the party whip and are told to vote there or there and do it. All of that kind of thing both makes it incomprehensible, but also it's just like, why does it work like this to any person who's not involved in politics? And there's no answer to that.
So finally, given the world as we find it and the struggles of austerity and all the other things that I think we're all facing, as you look forward, what a few of the most important things that an alliance of people, good thinking people who are not necessarily party tribes but are thinking about change, where ought the priority to be now in terms of campaigning, maybe?
I think we have to tackle the really big questions. I mean, you mentioned austerity. We have to say that, austerity, there was never any evidence that it was going to work anyway, but it has now clearly failed. And we have to invest in the future, invest in everything from renewable energy to public transport, to decent housing, to all the energy conservation. I could go on and on. But, to say austerity has failed, and we can draw the IMF on our side on this one. So, that should be an argument, and it's an argument that's not really properly being made. And we need to actually very much, say neoliberalism, globalisation, these things have hit the buffers economically and environmentally. The model is broken. And we need to take very small scale, relatively small scale arguments. I mean, I'm wearing the Protect Legal Aid badge today because I'm going to demo this afternoon. But draw together the fact that the threatened outsourcing of the courts and of legal aid ties to the outsourcing in the NHS, ties to the outsourcing of practically every other government department you can name, ties to the selling off of anything that isn't nailed down, or indeed everything that is nailed down by the government. And pull all those things together and say, this direction that we've been taking for the past 2 or 3 decades is the wrong direction. It has failed. And where the right broadly has been very successful is in making this sound and look like this is just natural, this is just the way things are. And we have to say, no, this is the way that you chose to make this, and we can choose a different direction. So we really have to make the basic argument that society can be and should be a cooperative organisation of people working together towards common goals. It's not nature naked in tooth and claw, everyone just going for their personal advantage, everyone just going for the profit motive, and that's how society has to work. Because it isn't, and it can't be.
Natalie, thank you very much. That's been really, really interesting.
Thank you.